I never imagined my life would spiral into this chaos. Here I am, sitting in this tiny rented room that reeks of dampness and regret, staring at bankruptcy papers and wondering how everything went so wrong. But I need someone to hear my side of the story, because everyone thinks they know what happened, but they have no idea what I was really going through. They see me as this reckless woman who threw away everything good in her life. But the truth is, I was just trying to escape a situation that was slowly destroying me from the inside. It all began 4 years ago when David and I seemed to have the perfect life. At least that's what everyone told us. I was working as a nurse at the county hospital, exhausted but fulfilled, believing I was making a difference in people's lives. David had his accounting firm, steady clients, predictable income. On paper, we looked like the ideal couple, responsible, hardworking, financially stable. But beneath the surface, something was eating away at me that I couldn't quite name. The long shifts at the hospital were draining me in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. I'd come home after 12-hour days dealing with pain and suffering, needing someone to understand the emotional weight I was carrying. David would be there with his spreadsheets and tax documents, asking about my day in that polite, distant way that made me feel like we were roommates rather than partners. "Sarah, you look tired," he'd say, not even glancing up from his laptop. "Maybe you should consider switching to day shifts. The night shifts are too much for you." Just like that. Like my career was some inconvenience he needed to manage rather than something that defined who I was. I tried explaining that I loved working nights, that I felt most useful during those critical hours when patients needed the most care. But David saw everything through his practice. A lens, sleep schedules, work-life balance, optimal productivity. "I'm not asking you to quit," he'd say in that reasonable tone that made me want to scream. "I'm just suggesting we think about what's sustainable long-term. You're burning yourself out, and it's affecting our relationship." Our relationship, like my dedication to my patients, was somehow selfish, like caring about my work was taking something away from him. The breaking point came when my supervisor offered me a position in the pediatric ICU. It was everything I'd been working toward: specialized training, higher responsibilities, the chance to work with the most vulnerable patients. But the schedule was demanding, and the emotional intensity was even higher than what I was already handling. David's reaction when I told him about the opportunity was exactly what I'd feared. He sat there calculating something in his head, probably running numbers about how this would affect our household routine. "That sounds like a lot of pressure," he said finally. "And with the extra training requirements, you'd be working even more hours. Are you sure that's what you want right now?" What I wanted? I'd been dreaming about pediatric intensive care since nursing school. I'd volunteered at children's hospitals, taken extra courses, done everything possible to prepare for this opportunity, and he was asking if I was sure it was what I wanted. "This is my career, David," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is what I've been working toward for years." "I know, and I'm proud of you," he said, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was humoring me. "I just want to make sure you're thinking about the bigger picture. We've been talking about starting a family, and this new position would make that more complicated." Starting a family. We'd had exactly 2 conversations about having children, both initiated by him, both involving timelines and financial planning, rather than dreams or excitement about our future together. I took the position anyway, and for 6 months I felt more alive than I had in years. Working with sick children and their families, being part of life and death decisions, feeling like my skills and compassion were making a real difference. It was everything I'd hoped it would be. But David grew more distant with each passing week. He'd make comments about my late dinners, my exhaustion after particularly difficult cases, the way I'd sometimes need to decompress by talking through what had happened during my shift. "You're always thinking about work," he complained one evening after I'd spent 20 minutes telling him about a successful surgery we'd performed on a 7-year-old. "Even when you're here, you're still there." That's when I started spending time at Murphy's bar after my shifts. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a quiet place where I could sit with a drink and process the intensity of my workday before going home to David's subtle disapproval and practical concerns. Murphy's was where I met Jake. He was a paramedic, someone who understood the weight of holding people's lives in your hands. The first time we talked, I was sitting at the bar after losing a patient, a 2-year-old who'd been brought in after a car accident. I couldn't stop the tears, couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done something different, something more. "Rough night?" he asked, sliding onto the stool next to me. When I looked up, I saw someone who had the same haunted look in his eyes that I'd been seeing in my own reflection, someone who'd clearly been where I was, feeling what I was feeling. "They don't prepare you for this part in school," I said, wiping my eyes with a napkin. "No, they don't," he agreed. "They teach you the technical stuff, the protocols, the procedures, but they don't teach you how to carry it all without letting it break you." We talked for 2 hours that night about the cases that stayed with us, the families we'd watched fall apart in hospital waiting rooms, the impossible decisions we'd witnessed. Jake understood things David never could. The way certain calls would replay in your mind for days, the guilt you felt about the patients you couldn't save, the weird mix of exhaustion and hypervigilance that came from constant exposure to human suffering. "Your husband doesn't get it?" he asked when I mentioned David's frustration with my work schedule. "He tries," I said, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure it was true. "He just thinks I take everything too personally." "That's not a flaw," Jake said. "That's what makes you good at what you do. The ones who don't take it personally burn out or become cold. You care because caring is what saves lives." It was exactly what I needed to hear. David saw my emotional investment in my work as a problem to be managed. Jake saw it as proof that I was exactly where I belonged. I didn't tell David about Jake, not directly. I just said I'd been stopping for a drink after particularly difficult shifts to decompress before coming home. It seemed like a reasonable compromise. I got the emotional support I needed, and David got a wife who wasn't crying into her dinner about losing patients. Jake and I started meeting regularly. Never planned, just whenever one of us needed to talk through a bad day or celebrate a good one. He'd tell me about the overdoses and domestic violence calls that haunted him, and I'd share the victories and losses from the PICU. For the first time in months, I felt like someone understood not just what I did, but why it mattered to me. "Your dedication is incredible," Jake told me one evening after I'd described spending an entire day with a family whose child was brain dead, helping them navigate the decision to donate organs. "Most people couldn't handle what you do." David's response to the same story had been to suggest I consider transferring to a less emotionally demanding unit. Jake made me remember why I'd become a nurse in the first place. With him, I could talk about the profound privilege of being present during people's worst and most important moments. David saw my job as a source of stress that needed to be minimized. Jake saw it as a calling that deserved respect. The shift happened gradually. I started looking forward to my conversation with Jake more than I looked forward to going home. When David would make his subtle comments about my work affecting our relationship, I'd think about Jake's understanding and support. When David suggested I was taking my job too seriously, I'd remember Jake saying that caring was what made me good at what I did. Jake was going through his own struggles. His ex-wife was making his life hell with custody battles and financial demands. He was barely making ends meet between child support and legal fees, picking up extra shifts just to stay afloat. "The system is rigged against guys like me," he'd say after telling me about another expensive court hearing. "She gets everything, and I get to work myself to death just to see my kids every other weekend." I started helping him out, covering his drinks when we met, lending him money for gas when he was short, even paying for his legal consultation when his lawyer fees became overwhelming. It felt good to support someone who supported me, someone who understood the sacrifices we made in our work. "I hate taking money from you," Jake would say, but I could see the relief in his face when I'd slip him cash for groceries or help with his rent. "You're not taking anything," I'd tell him. "You listen to me. You understand what I'm going through. This is just returning the favor." David never questioned where the money was going. He was so focused on our budget spreadsheets and savings goals that he didn't notice the cash withdrawals or the unexplained expenses. His trust made everything easier, even as it made me feel guilty. For 8 months, I felt like I was living a double life. During the day, I was David's practical wife who needed to consider work-life balance and long-term planning. At Murphy's with Jake, I was someone whose passion and dedication were valued rather than managed. Jake understood why I couldn't just switch to day shifts or transfer to a less demanding unit. He understood why I needed to talk through difficult cases instead of just leaving work at work. Most importantly, he understood that my career wasn't just a job, it was part of who I was. You deserve someone who sees your strength instead of trying to tone it down, he told me one night after I'd mentioned another conversation with David about finding balance. I started to believe him. The mistake that destroyed everything happened on a Tuesday night in March. I'd had an especially difficult shift. We'd lost a teenager in a car accident, and his family's grief had been devastating to witness. I needed to talk through what had happened, needed someone who understood the weight of holding a family together while their world collapsed. When I got home, David was in the living room with his laptop, working on tax returns for one of his clients. He looked up when I came in, and his smile was genuine but distracted. "Hey, how was work?" he asked, already looking back at his screen. "Rough night," I said, hoping he'd close the laptop and actually listen for once. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, still typing. "There's leftover Chinese food in the fridge if you're hungry." That was it. No follow-up questions, no invitation to talk, no recognition that I might need anything more than leftover takeout after watching a family's world end. I should have just gone to bed. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Actually, I think I'm going to go out for a drink. I need to decompress." David looked up then, finally giving me his full attention. "It's almost midnight, Sarah. Can't you decompress here?" "Not the way I need to," I said, and there was something in my tone that made his expression shift. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked. And that's when I made my fatal error. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and frustrated by months of feeling unsupported. I wanted him to understand what he was missing, what someone else was providing that he wasn't. "Sometimes I need to talk to someone who actually understands what I do," I said. "Someone who gets why these cases affect me instead of just telling me to leave work at work." David's face went very still. "Someone?" I could have stopped there, could have explained that I meant my colleagues, other healthcare workers who understood the emotional toll of our jobs. Instead, I kept talking. "There's this paramedic I've been talking to, Jake. He actually listens when I need to process what happens at work, instead of just suggesting I switch to an easier unit." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched David's expression change from confusion to understanding, to something that looked like betrayal. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long what?" "How long have you been talking to Jake the paramedic who actually listens to you?" I should have minimized it then, should have made it sound casual and professional. Instead, the words came tumbling out. Months of feeling unheard and unsupported, months of finding understanding somewhere David couldn't provide it, months of emotional intimacy that I'd been hiding. "It's not what you think," I said, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure what I thought it was anymore. David closed his laptop very carefully and looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "I need some time to think about this," he said finally. "I can't be here right now." He packed a bag that night and left, and I didn't hear from him for 2 weeks. When he finally called, his voice was different, formal and distant, like he was talking to a stranger. "I want you to move out," he said without preamble. "The house is in my name, and I can't have you here anymore." "David, please, let's just talk about this. Let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," he said. "You made your choice. You've been making it for months, apparently." I tried everything. I cried, I apologized, I explained about feeling unsupported and misunderstood. I told him about the stress of my job, about how Jake had just been someone who understood my work struggles. I begged him to meet with me so we could work things out in person. But David was done. "My lawyer will be in touch about the separation agreement," he said. The legal proceedings were devastating. Since the house was in David's name, and I couldn't prove I'd contributed to the mortgage payments, I'd been giving Jake money instead of saving receipts, I had no claim to our home. David's lawyer painted me as someone who'd been financially irresponsible and emotionally unfaithful. That's when Jake suggested we try to reason with David directly. "He's being vindictive," Jake said when I told him about David's refusal to even split our shared belongings fairly. "Maybe if he understood how his coldness pushed you away, he'd be more reasonable." We found out where David was staying, with his brother Michael, and decided to have a conversation. Not to threaten him, just to help him understand how his lack of emotional support had contributed to our problems. When David came out to his car that morning, he looked shocked to see us both there. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said. "You won't return my calls. You won't meet with me. What choice do I have?" "You had the choice to be honest with me," David said, his voice cold. "You had the choice not to have an emotional affair." Jake stepped forward then. "Look, man, Sarah's been going through a lot. Her job is incredibly stressful, and she needed support you weren't giving her." I could see David's jaw tighten. "And you are." "I'm someone who actually listened to her," Jake said. "Someone who understood what she was dealing with instead of just telling her to find an easier job." The conversation escalated quickly. Jake was trying to explain how David's dismissive attitude had pushed me towards someone who appreciated my dedication to my work. David was getting angrier and more defensive. At one point, Jake grabbed David's arm and said something about how David needed to take responsibility for his part in our marriage failing if he didn't want this situation to get uglier. I had no idea that Michael had security cameras installed around his property after a break-in the previous year. The police showed up at my apartment 2 days later. Apparently, Jake's comment about things getting ugly, combined with him grabbing David's arm, constituted intimidation and harassment. They arrested both of us, and suddenly I was facing criminal charges for trying to have a conversation with my own husband. Everything fell apart after that. The hospital suspended me pending the outcome of my criminal case. Being arrested for intimidation made me a liability to their reputation, especially in a job that required trust and good judgment. Jake disappeared the moment things got serious. The man who'd told me I deserved better, who'd understood my struggles, who'd seen my strength, gone the instant it became inconvenient for him. When the police questioned us separately, suddenly everything had been my idea. Suddenly, I was the unstable one who'd dragged him into my marital problems. The criminal charges destroyed what was left of my separation agreement. The judge saw the intimidation incident as evidence that I was volatile and potentially dangerous. Instead of getting any share of our assets, I ended up with legal debt and a restraining order. Now I'm here in this horrible studio apartment, facing charges too. Hat could mean jail time, completely broke from legal fees, and unable to work in healthcare because of my pending case. Everyone who used to respect me has turned away, convinced that I'm some kind of unstable woman who destroyed her own life through poor choices. Jake won't even return my texts. The man who used to tell me my dedication was admirable, who understood my passion for helping people, who saw how underappreciated I was, vanished the moment things got complicated. And David? David has moved on like our 6 years of marriage meant nothing. He's got his house, his business, his clean reputation, and his sense of moral superiority. Everyone sees him as the wronged party, the hard-working husband whose wife had an emotional affair and then harassed him. But they don't see the whole story. They don't know about the years of feeling like my career was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a calling to be supported. They don't know about the loneliness of being married to someone who saw my passion as a problem that needed solving. They don't know about coming home from life and death situations only to be told I was taking work too seriously. I'm not saying I made perfect choices. I know the emotional affair was wrong, and I know confronting David at Michael's house was a mistake, but I was drowning. I was a woman trying to hold on to herself in a marriage that was slowly convincing me that everything I cared about was excessive and impractical. Now everyone gets to feel righteous about my downfall. David gets to be the patient husband who tried to help his wife find balance until she betrayed him. And I'm the unstable nurse who threw away everything good in her life for someone who didn't even stick around when things got difficult. But that's not the complete truth. The truth is messier and more complicated. It involves two people who stopped seeing each other clearly, a woman who needed support she wasn't getting, and a system that punishes you for making desperate choices when you're already at your breaking point. I just wish someone could understand that I didn't set out to hurt anyone. I was trying to find a place where I could be valued for who I actually was, instead of who everyone else needed me to be. I was trying to preserve the part of myself that cared deeply about my work, that saw helping people as more than just a job. Instead, I'm facing possible jail time, complete financial ruin, and I'm more isolated than I've ever been. And everyone thinks this is exactly what I deserve for being selfish and reckless. Maybe they're right. Maybe this is what happens when you refuse to accept that your dreams and passions are secondary to everyone else's comfort and convenience. But I still can't shake the feeling that if just one person had really supported who I was instead of trying to manage who I was becoming, none of this would have happened. Now it's too late for any of that. The damage is done, the consequences are real, and I'm the only one left to face them. I just wanted someone to understand that I never meant for things to end up this way. I was just trying to hold on to myself in a world that kept telling me I was too much, too intense, too invested in things that didn't matter as much as stability and practicality. But I guess that doesn't matter now. All that matters is what I did, not why I did it. And what I did was destroy everything I'd worked for, including myself.